but that's what holds people back, Cynthia. And I want to get into the book, but this is heading part of the conversation. Is people think, well, I don't want to say things now in a book, and then they've proven wrong later. I'm like, no, almost every book has had that happen.
Yeah.
Keto has had that happen. I put in there about higher fat, and now I believe you should probably put the focus on protein with the natural fats that come with it. That was not a belief when I was writing it in 2012, 2013,
Yeah.
that I now have 10 years later. So it's okay if you have changing beliefs and, oh, it's not going to be right down the road. You put it out there now, let people go down the rabbit hole. Because I wrote those books, you wrote this book now. So it's like, it comes around, it goes around.
Yes. And I think it's okay to say know better, do better. Like I say as a clinician, a lot of what I used to teach about nutrition and fat and cholesterol was completely wrong.
Yeah.
And I always say know better, do better. So, making a concerted effort to acknowledge that sometimes, our opinions are going to evolve, shift, and change. And that is okay. That is part of learning. That is part of growing. That is part of thinking beyond, what you learned in school. And certainly I trained at a great place. But a lot of what I learned, it kind of makes me cringe. I used to tell patients, as an example, I used to tell patients to use, Brummel and Brown and Smart Balance. It makes me cringe that I didn't just say eat the butter.
Yeah.
But that was back when, we thought saturated fat was evil and terrible. And that was the bane of what was driving a lot of inflammatory issues and heart disease, etc.
Well, let's get into you pushing an eating disorder. Fasting.
That probably won't be the last time I hear that, Jimmy.
No. I trust me, I get it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I have for many years, but I want to focus on first about fasting because everybody talks about blood sugar and insulin control. Cool, all great. But the hormone connection, especially for women, take us down the rabbit hole of the benefits to the hormone, the whole endocrine system, especially the female endocrine system. How is fasting a powerful tool in their toolbox?
Well, I think we have to first talk about what a woman's menstrual cycle is like. So we know from the day we start bleeding until before ovulation, that's when the hormone estrogen, this is the follicular phase, when estrogen predominates. Women can get away with a whole lot more in this phase of their menstrual cycle. They can push their workouts. They can, push the protein, fat macros. They can fast longer. And that is because in many ways, estrogen gives us the opportunity to be able to push our bodies in different ways. We know when we kind of transition after ovulation into the luteal phase, when progesterone predominates, different type of hormone, a little less insulin sensitive than estrogen. And so because progesterone tends to be a little bit more insulin resistant, this is not the time to be doing these really prolonged fasts that is going to push cortisol, that's going to drive more blood sugar dysregulation. So I often have to remind women, you're a rock star the first 2 weeks. That third week of your menstrual cycle, you can start kind of backing off on the intensity of your exercise, the duration of your fasting. I didn't say not fasting, but maybe you're doing 12 or 13 hours. And the other caveat is the week before your menstrual cycle, you don't want to be fasting more than 12 hours. So really it's digestive rest. Now, if you're at peak fertile years, so under the age of 35, really important to understand that your body, even if you choose not to become pregnant, your body is very sensitive to food scarcity. There's a lot of communication, the hypothalamus pituitary axis, communication with the ovaries, the adrenals, etc. Food scarcity can be a real issue. So if you're a thin woman under the age of 35, peak cycling years, peak fertility years, those are women I generally don't recommend that they are fasting every day. Maybe they're fasting a couple times a week, beginning part of their menstrual cycle, follicular phase. However, if you're a woman that's insulin resistant, you're insulin resistant, you have a desire to get pregnant, there's probably some value from doing more regular fasting periods, but you have to lean into understanding that your menstrual cycle is not something to apologize for, that your menstrual cycle is closely interrelated to that hormonal regulation between the brain and the ovaries. I tell everyone, if your period's a little wonky, the first cycle or two you're doing fasting, that's okay. Your period goes away. That's a sign that for you, your body perceives this food scarcity piece is too much. We talk about feast famine. So that's number one. I would say the other piece is perimenopause, the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause, and menopause, 12 months without a menstrual cycle, different time period. We are exquisitely sensitive to sleep quality, stress, nutrition, especially inflammatory foods, gluten, grains, dairy, sugar, soy in particular, alcohol is another one, the right types of exercise. And so when we talk about hormonal regulation, our bodies aren't as adept at responding to stress because our ovaries are producing less progesterone. Progesterone is this kind of mellow hormone. It's the hormone that I always say helps us sleep, helps with mood disorders, anxiety, depression. We start producing less of that. We start having more circulating estrogen. This can create the perfect storm for weight gain, breast tenderness, moodiness, again, the sleep issues. And so really leaning into what is our bodies telling us and understanding that as we are making less progesterone in our ovaries, our adrenals are picking up the slack. And so if you're not managing your stress, you're eating a highly processed diet, you're not managing stress, and that doesn't mean 2 minutes of meditation once a day. That doesn't cut it anymore. You are setting yourself up for a degree of hormonal dysregulation that is going to make fasting more challenging. So I always say start with, sleep as a foundation to help manage blood sugar, to better manage insulin. And I tell people all the time that you really do have to think this methodically, but over time it is not something you're thinking about every day. But using those 4 areas as a barometer with which to check in with yourself to see where you are. So again, first 2 weeks of the menstrual cycle and perimenopause, you have the ability to do a little bit more fasting. Last 2 weeks, not as much, and really leaning into understanding what's going on physiologically, understanding, if you're going to have carbohydrates in your diet, I'm not anti-carb, the right types of carbs. You have more carbohydrate threshold at the beginning part of your menstrual cycle than you do right before you get your cycle. And it's important for people to understand, like if they're trending their CGM data or glucometers and like, why is my blood sugar up the week before I get my menstrual cycle? That's a byproduct of progesterone. And so when we talk about hormonal regulation, there's a whole lot more than just the sex hormones, but I think it's super important to understand it's not just about insulin. It's not just about cortisol. There are a cascade of other hormones that are super, super important to lean into in terms of our physiology so that you understand how best to fast. Now, menopause, I have to touch on this. This is the only time in our lives, I would say, before we go through puberty and when we're in menopause, that our hormones are much more stable. There is not as much hormonal flux as when we are in our cycling years or perimenopause. So women in menopause can push the envelope a bit. They can put the accelerator down. They can do some longer fasts. They can do more prolonged fasts fairly effortlessly if all those lifestyle pieces are falling into place. Getting enough sleep, anti-inflammatory nutrition, doing the right types of exercise, which involve lifting heavy things and walking and not doing chronic cardio, which I've never been a fan of. I never liked. And then just understanding that they have to manage those things pretty well. Now, I can tell you without question, menopausal women seem to have the easiest time overall. I'm saying overall, there's always exceptions overall because they don't have to worry about, what's their progesterone from day to day, what's their estradiol from day to day. Things are a little bit more stable, although they can also be a little bit frustrating. And there are some unique aspects to menopause that in particular can be a source of endless frustration for a lot of women, but it doesn't mean it's not possible to do really, really well with fasting. I've seen some pretty incredible things happen for women.
Well, and that makes sense that fasting would be great for menopausal women because isn't that when women tend to pick up a few more pounds, maybe start developing, maybe underlying a little bit insulin resistance if they don't change anything about what they were doing for ovulation? So suddenly fasting becomes an answer that they didn't know they needed an answer to.
Right. And the thing I find really interesting is that we know we become more physiologically insulin resistant. If you change nothing, we physiologically become more insulin resistant as we get older because we have waxing and waning estradiol, again, one of the key hormones that helps with insulin sensitivity. But it's also sarcopenia, so this muscle loss with aging, which is not a question of if, but when. So you want to maintain lean muscle mass. I talk a lot about this in the book, that most women are grossly under eating protein. I'm sure it's the same for men. And so making sure you're getting sufficient animal-based protein. And yes, animal-based protein is superior. And that is something that's important for people to understand. I'm not saying don't ever have your lentils or your quinoa, but you can't eat copious amounts of those kinds of carbs. So really kind of leaning into this piece about understanding that it's protein plus lifting heavy things. Maybe it's starting with body weight exercise. Muscle is the organ of longevity, a la Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. really understanding that muscle protein synthesis, eating enough protein, building muscle is going to help with insulin sensitivity. Think of your muscles as glucose reservoirs. This is really, really important for people to understand. So stop the chronic cardio, aim for more protein, really looking at, anywhere from 35 to 40 to 50 grams of protein with each meal. For most women, will shut off those satiety signals. So you won't want to keep eating because you're too darn full. Like I ate in between podcasts and IG lives, and I pushed my protein threshold because I knew today's a day, it's going to be busy. I'm not going to be able to probably sit down and have like a leisurely lunch. And so I'm very full right now. I probably won't eat until dinner time. And that's really a beautiful thing. So protein is your friend, healthy fats, the right types of carbs. But I find most women eat too little protein, not enough healthy fats, and too many carbs. So when you look at your plate, think about that.
And look, I think a lot of women have had it indoctrinated into them that they overeat. So they have traditionally ate. So they don't know what an appropriate amount of food is. So therefore, when they go into a fast, a la Cynthia Thurlow telling them to go on an intermittent fast, they're like, Cynthia, I'm starving 8 hours in. It's because you haven't trained yourself to build up the nutrition, not just calorically, but nutritionally dense. Nutrition density in there is also important. Like all of that comes into play about how successful you can be on a fast. Like you said, you had that one really nice meal. It's probably going to end up being an OMAD today for you, and you're going to be able to fast for a very long time. Why? Because it was enough food and it was the nutrient density in the food that allow you to do that.
Yeah. And I think for anyone that if you're watching this and you haven't been fasting or eating less often, like really the first step is to stop snacking, because if you don't allow yourself to snack between meals, you're going to be forced to reallocate what you're eating with each meal. And so push the protein. You will be full. You will not be looking for more food. You will say, I had my steak, I had my chicken, I had my fish, etc. I'm full. Like I had my non-starchy vegetables, I had my healthy fat in my meal. So salmon, ribeye, etc. are great examples of protein sources that have got.
That
You're
sounds
shaking your head.
thinking of a surf and turf. As you said, salmon and ribeye, I was like, ooh.
Yeah. And I think each one of us have to decide like what works best. I tend to do better with leaner meats, leaner proteins, which is a bummer, but I think it's okay. I mean, I'll just add like butter to my vegetables or add some olive oil to a salad. I mean, there's all sorts of ways to get those healthy fats, the right healthy fats into your diet. And that does not involve blocks of cheese and bags of nuts. Like that's where I see a lot of women get into trouble. It's very easy. Like I love salted macadamia nuts, but you better believe I portion out a serving, I put the bag away because it's too easy. If you leave the bag out, all of a sudden two become, like a quarter cup becomes half the bag, and then you've derailed all your hard work. And so just acknowledging that sometimes those healthy fats, you have to try to keep to a portion size. Like I think a portion size of cheese is like the size of your like thumbnail. So it's really not a lot. It's easy to overeat that stuff.
Yes. Now, I want to bring up a topic you brought up in your book, which I think is important regarding supplementation during the fast. When I first started kind of dibble dabbling in it and very sloppily fasting, learned from my mistake. I did things like kombucha and bone broth and thinking I needed those things. And I found that they actually stoked more hunger than anything. Probably because my body was interpreting, okay, we're eating, we're not eating. What's
It's like a wet balloon. What? Yeah.
and so there is this debate out there about whether you should use salt and other kind of electrolyte type of supplements versus not. There's also dry versus water fasting. Like, what say you on those topics?
I think this, so my nurse practitioner brain does not like the concept of dehydration. So I tend to be a water fast. I believe in clean fasting. Exactly. So Jimmy's got that. But you have to remember, I also have this cardiology background. So I'm a huge fan of electrolytes. And so I'm a big fan of, if you do nothing else, salt your food and salt your water. But I do like electrolytes. I like magnesium and chloride and sodium and potassium in the right amounts in your water. So in a fasted state, I am a big believer in the benefits of black coffee. It's bitter is what we want, because bitter is not going to evoke that insulin response. And there's all sorts of benefits from bitter teas and black coffee